basically you have to all get up and dance to this. It's a stress thing. I'm serious. Up we go. It's Friday. I want to see it.
Right, turn off the lights. We're gonna lose our minds tonight. What's the dealio? I love when it's not too much. 5 a.m. turn the radio up. Where's the rock and roll? Why so serious? So raise the glass if you are alone. In all the right ways.
So health and energy. So obviously if you've had a number of micro stresses constantly wearing you down, you may have no energy to deal with the stressor that comes your way. The same with health. If you psychologically or physiologically are unwell and you experience a stressor, be it big or small, depending on what else is going on, you may not be able to cope. So Lazarus and Folkman talking about these points. Then the positive beliefs, very closely linked to self-esteem, as I said, self-efficacy, and the belief in oneself to think, can I actually do this? And obviously individuals who, for whatever reason, it may be because of years of prejudice, harassment at work, growing up in a family where there was no affirmation, innately or intrinsically in some way within their environments they've never felt affirmed and they've got low self-esteem, they feel very disempowered, they have an external locus of control, so the individual feels like there's nothing I can do to help myself, it would be that they may think I can't cope. This is completely out of my control and I actually don't have the ability to utilize anything at my disposal to help me to cope. Very important. Problem-solving skills. So if somebody's never been really taught how to solve a problem, to approach a problem and think about it in a strategic way, and things feel overwhelming, then obviously individuals may not cope. And sometimes this is why coaches get involved or psychologists, or you might have, as I've said before, pastoral counseling, a parent may guide another elder in the community or a peer who may say, be able to, while somebody's feeling very overwhelmed, very swamped in emotion and stresses, say, listen, let's sit down and strategically break this apart. It's called task breakdown often, or goal-focused approach, or solution-focused therapy, where you're actually approaching it in a much more cognitive, systematic way. Cognitive behavioral therapy can do this a lot, but a lot of that's also about challenging thoughts and beliefs. Material resources. Very important. So if you can afford to see a counselor or psychologist, that's important. You may not have the material resources to do that. You may not have some of the resources that if, for example, you were thinking, well, I can't pay, certain bills, and now we're talking about actual money, but I can't pay certain bills, and how do you solve that problem? If you don't have the material resources to solve it, it's very, very difficult. If you don't have as I've said a lot before, housing, electricity, some of the other basic needs, sometimes it's very difficult to get past certain issues. If you are, for example, somebody who's been through serious war zone and you're sitting in a space where, problem-focused, problem-solving skills, let's think about it. The country's at civil war. Really and truly, where the hell are problem-solving skills going to come in? Now, they may, in small ways, about getting water. It might be that you form a bucket line where people bring buckets through, and not everyone has to walk to a water spot every day, but people bring a bucket and pass it along a line. There may be small things that you can solve, but there may be others that, honestly, because you don't have the material resources and the ways, it might be then about emotion-focused coping, which is a different style. Social skills, and social skills being very important because if you don't have social skills, you often can't create zones of social support, and that's positive social support. Not those kinds of social support that looks like it's helpful, but will actually lead you into spaces where perhaps you will cope less well. Okay, so it's important to think about social support that will really be able to practically support you, either through if you needed a lift to a hospital, or you needed to be lent some money, or you needed to have your house cleaned and you were ill, or the children needed to be fed, or you needed somebody to take notes for you in lectures because you couldn't get there, things like that. Or it might be about just listening to you and providing emotional support. And then problem-focused coping, we've spoken about briefly, is about changing the nature of a situation. And emotion-focused coping. So the question is, because there's a big debate around this, and actually most people in psychology believe that problem-focused coping is better than emotion-focused coping. But now, problem-focused coping, again, aimed at changing the source of the stress, and emotion-focused coping, dealing with how you feel about the stressor. Which do you think is better? And why? Traditionally, problem-focused coping has been seen as the most useful, but that's not necessarily the answer. Yes. Okay. So the answer here was perhaps emotion-focused, because once you've managed your emotional response to the stressor, you may then be better equipped to approach solving the problem. Great. Any others? Yes. So emotion-focused. So you're saying if you can deal with your emotions around the problem, you could deal with future. Yeah, okay. And emotion-focused coping traditionally has been linked to, and this is how it's defined, it's interesting, about avoiding the emotion or being distracted by the emotion or somehow suppressing it. So sometimes, often it's interesting that what happens sometimes with, I've noticed with men more than women, and with women it happens in the converse in certain cultures, and it for a long time, certainly in South Africa and certain religious cultures, for women they weren't really allowed to be angry. I'm not so sure about South African women, but certainly some women, there's certain places you're not allowed to be angry. So they used to feel a bit of anger. I know a lot of my family's from Ireland, and there, a woman being angry, especially because of the religious guilt, wasn't okay. So anger would start to come up, and anger is a very powerful emotion. It would certainly, it's not on the board anymore, but activate that sympathetic nervous system. Sometimes you'd go into fight or flight, and what would happen is they'd then get anxious. So anxiety would very quickly smother anger, and the anger might manifest in other ways. I've often seen this in eating disorders as well, very powerfully. The anger then is directed inward, and anxiety seems to manifest, but there may be a lot of anger. The converse seems to sometimes happen for men, is that men may feel sadness or pain or hurt or anxiety, and it manifests in extreme rage. But underlying that rage, and I'm not saying the rage is not, what's the word, valid, because there may be some anger, but there may be other emotions there. But it's more acceptable for a man to seem angry. So when he's really hurt, to become angry. And I'm generalizing hugely now, but in certain cultures, it would be more acceptable than to sit there and say, I'm really hurt and sad. And whereas for a woman, it may have been more acceptable. So it's interesting how these emotions would have turned and changed into other states. But if you're working with individuals, there's often many layers that come through. And that would have been emotion-focused. But also emotion-focused could be about resolving. And typically it's been thought of, as I said, as a negative form. But think about again, you're in a war zone, or you've just watched 2 planes fly into the towers in America, but you're in New York. Problem-focused or emotion-focused? Think about it. What do you think? I mean, there may be some problems you can seriously solve, but what about the rest of it? No. What's going on around you? I mean, everything's become insecure, because that was a pivotal moment for the US. The US thought for a very long time, and again I'm generalizing, if there's any American students they want to refute this, please do, but I think we felt much more secure and didn't feel that anyone was going to actually attack them on their own land. I mean, once that happened, and then there was the London stuff, and then stuff happened in France, suddenly everyone realized that people could come in and attack them in their own space, come in almost undetected, into spaces where they weren't being policed very strongly because they didn't think it was necessary to police those zones so powerfully. And this created a mass insecurity in the population, thinking, we're actually very, very vulnerable. Look what the hell just happened. Who in their wildest dreams? I remember actually watching footage for that. In my office, somebody called me, and it's almost like I was watching some kind of Hollywood movie. You think, are they having a laugh here? It's when that April Fool's thing they once did about, then they said they'd taken away Table Mountain, and they had a picture on the Cape Times. They'd removed the mountain. Honestly, it was like that. You thought somebody's playing around, if this can't actually be happening. It's almost completely surreal. So once that had happened, though, it's interesting, when other events started happening, people believed in them more, because suddenly it was, this is real stuff, this can happen, we are vulnerable to this. And, but emotion-focused coping might have been more powerful. So there are times, and I think in context, remember context-specific, where problem solving is very appropriate, and you need to problem solve. You can't just deal with it emotionally. You can deal with it emotionally for some time, but you obviously need to face the problem and go through it strategically, and other times when emotion-focused may be much better. And a lot of the emotion focus could be about Meditation is one. Changing a state, how powerful it is, recognizing what emotions underlying something, so identifying and staying with an emotion rather than distracting and avoiding. And then proactive coping, very important. So taking steps to avoid a stressor. Some people obviously enjoy certain stresses, and I was just thinking, you know, bungee jumping and things like that, and I wouldn't necessarily call that proactive coping, but if you're somebody who's very frightened by certain events, which other people might actually enjoy the activation of that sympathetic nervous system, they go for that. They like it. In fact, there's some people who love, even in a work environment or study environment, the higher the stress gets, the more they seem to thrive. And there's others who, the higher the stress gets, the more incompetent they become. So the proactive coping, again, is very personal. It's if I thrive on the stress environment, if I see it as a challenge, the more I'm pumping adrenaline and epinephrine, and this may or may not be a good idea. Type A personalities are typical type A personalities described as people who are often hostile, who get very impatient, but also often thrive on this constant adrenal pump where they're constantly hitting challenges. They love having very vigorous debates, heated arguments, challenges. Things have got to be moving and shifting. There can't be a lot of peaceful staying still for long periods of time. But proactive coping would be thinking, if you know that you've been in a stressful situation and you know that there's more of those kinds of stressful situations coming, what can you do? So, you know, exams are coming. What may you do? Now, this would be culturally mediated very powerfully. And again, it might be you may pray a lot. That might be something important for you. You may change the way you eat. You may start to exercise. What else may you do? What do you guys do in exams? If you're proactive coping. I'm assuming you are sometimes. I know not all of the time. What might you do? Study with peers sometimes. Studying on your own for some people can be very anxiety-provoking. They feel if I'm with a peer it might be helpful. We kind of motivate each other. We're comrades in this. What else might you do? Proactive coping. Or have you not thought about proactive coping in studying? Ever? Yes. Okay, so planning a study schedule and then sticking to it. Yes. Okay. What else? I love those study schedules. You just color them, all sorts of different colors, and you'd have all these great dreams and plans of sticking to it. Pink, the morning, green, but you'd spend all this time planning your study schedule, never actually getting to studying. Yeah. Anything else? Proactive coping. Okay, so obviously one of the points we have made is the interaction between coping and health extremely complex. Because people cope in very different ways. And sometimes these ways can be very powerful and other times not. And sometimes one healthful behavior can become quite destructive. We're talking about exercise. In moderation, it can be quite helpful. But if a person is completely reliant on it and, of course, over-exercises to the point of injury and then exercises on that injury, it can become quite a detrimental coping method. And lots of people do become addicted to exercise. It can be very powerful for coping. But at the same time can also be detrimental if somebody becomes very obsessed with that exercise and often exercises into injury. What other styles of coping? Not thinking about proactive coping, just not even your styles, anything. And there can be constructive, destructive, healthy, unhealthy. How do you cope? Everyone's very shy, yes. Okay, sleeping, right? Anything, coping. Eating, all right, other styles. We've done some of this at the beginning, but I'm just interested to see if any of them have changed or moved. Eating, sleeping, what else? Does anyone here meditate? Yes. Okay, so going out with your friends, yeah? Any other thing? Does anyone exercise? Do you exercise? Okay. Anyone meditate? Anyone stand in the shower and sing for a little while? There's a style of coping. What else? Talk to a friend, parent, lover, partner, car guard, whoever. You know, I'm serious, making a connection. Often for people it's important making a connection. Taking yourself away from yourself just for a moment, hearing what's going on in someone else's life, actually can be a great style of coping if you're very inward looking. not saying always do that, but sometimes it's actually very useful. You just hear someone else, what's going on with you, and suddenly you're not completely overwhelmed and overly invested in what's happening for you. And physical and mental health. So the styles of coping that are traditional, the styles of treatment, and we will talk more about this treatment of 10, that are particularly used for stress are cognitive behavioral therapy. Do all of you have an idea of what that is? So in cognitive behavioral therapy, you have a thought. Typically, you have a thought or belief, which is then challenged. And that is to change the emotion or the physiological arousal of the body. So when you challenge that thought, and then hopefully it will also change your behavior. So if, for example, I think, okay, so I'm going to stick with studying. So I think I've got a lot of work to do. I've got a lot of work to do, and I get very stressed out. And I think, well, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go. But as my activation of my sympathetic nervous system happens, I immediately crave a cigarette. So that's my behavior. But now I want to give up smoking. So now what happens? How would you deal with that? I want to give up smoking. Desperately. But the automatic thing that happens as soon as I have activation of a sympathetic nervous system is that I crave a cigarette. That's almost default position. That I want to give up smoking. Yes? Okay, so what might you be able to do? Yes. Okay, so something that you could replace. So, but again, we might track back to a thought, and it might also be, it could be a thought or it could be behavioral. So you could just breathing, or find another way. Because some people would say a cigarette's like I get a little break, a mini break. I allow myself that, and I only allow myself that if I'm having a cigarette. So it might be finding another way of a break. So it could be. So CBT looks at cognitive changing of belief or thoughts, or behavioral change. So breathing in a different way, and starting to almost like rewire the brain, to not default to a belief, thinking, I can't do this, or I'm going to fail, or I've got too much work to cope with. Changing that belief state, which again would not then that there would be no activation of that sympathetic nervous system, and also perhaps doing a behavior, like just sitting on the floor cross-legged and taking 5 very deep breaths, or dancing around crazily to Gangnam Style, because we missed that one. So seriously, and initially that wouldn't be that easy, because the default position is, I've got so much work to do, I can't cope, I'm not going to be able to do this. Cigarette. Okay, so it might be going, change that thought, I've got a lot of work, but I've planned a schedule, there's problem-focused coping, and I do feel like a cigarette, but what I'm going to do instead is, and changing that connection. So that's CBT. And with CBT, which is one of the more powerful ways of coping with stress, is actually looking at solution-focused coping. There's another one called dialectical behavioral therapy. And I can see you shifting, so we're obviously near the end. Dialectical behavioral therapy, right on, Nelly. And so it's DBT, CBT, and a lot of the movements of those types of therapies are the most popular, because they don't entail people sitting in therapy for years and years and years. If you can afford to and go for psychoanalysis, etc., great. But for a lot of government health services, this is not possible. So it's about DBT, which is about actually dealing with emotions and thoughts and beliefs, CBT, and a lot of the waves like solution-focused therapy, problem-focused therapy, and all of those. And that's where I'm going to end.